Imagine a country so rich in natural resources, it's literally treasure buried under the ground. But who gets to dig it up? And more importantly, who gets to profit from it? Well, this very question sparked an epic legal battle in the Philippines, one that put an indigenous tribe head-to-head with their own government and a massive global mining company. Let's get into the story of how a nation's wealth was put on trial. So it all boils down to this one huge question. Who really owns all that stuff under the ground? Is it the people who've lived on that land for generations? Is it the government, which is supposed to represent everyone? Or is it the companies that have the money and the tech to actually get it out? This is the core conflict we're going to unpack. All right, so who are the players in this showdown? In one corner, you have the Bugal-B'laan Tribal Association. For them, this wasn't just some abstract legal fight. This was about their very existence. They argued that this mining deal would lead to their, and I'm quoting here, irremediable displacement from the land their ancestors called home. And in the other corner, the Philippine government, eager for foreign investment, teaming up with Western Mining Corporation, a huge Australian company. So what did the B'laan tribe do? They did something incredibly bold. They didn't just protest, they went straight to the top, to the Supreme Court. And they didn't just challenge the deal, they challenged the entire law that made the deal possible, the Philippine Mining Act of 1995. They argued the law itself was illegal, that it broke the country's own constitution. And we're not talking about a small plot of land here. The scale is, well, it's just massive. The agreement at the heart of this dispute covered almost 100,000 hectares. That's a chunk of land that stretches across 4 different provinces. You can see why the stakes were so incredibly high. To really get what their challenge was all about, we've got to dig into the core of their argument, and it all hinges on a deep dive into the country's legal history and the very definition of ownership. You see, that history is the absolute key to this whole case. To understand why the court ruled the way it did, we have to rewind the clock and look at how the idea of who owns the nation's wealth has been fought over for centuries. It all kicks off with this idea brought over by Spain. It's called the Regalian Doctrine. And you know, the concept is actually pretty simple. The king, or today, the state, owns everything. All the land, all the minerals, all the resources. The state is the original and ultimate owner of it all. But, of course, things didn't stay that way. During the American era, they brought in something called a concession system. Basically, the government could grant private companies, including American ones, the right to go in and exploit resources. But then, with independence came this huge wave of nationalism. The 1935 Constitution brought back the Regalian Doctrine and took it one giant step further. It declared that the nation's resources were for Filipinos, period. So the idea was crystal clear, right? The nation's wealth for the nation's people. But as the economy developed, that clear line started to get a little blurry, and that led to a new and, as we'll see, a very controversial type of agreement. Under the 1973 Constitution, this new thing was introduced, the service contract. Now, on paper, it looked like a pretty smart idea. If a Filipino company had the rights to resources but didn't have the cash or the tech, they could partner up with a foreign company. The key words here, and you're going to want to remember these, were financial, technical, management, or other forms of assistance. But people started getting worried, and fast. There was this growing fear, as Commissioner Noledo pointed out later, that these so-called service contracts were just becoming a giant loophole, a way to circumvent the Constitution's core principle and basically hand over the country's wealth to foreign companies. So here's the bottom line. The critics were basically saying these service contracts were a sham. They argued that foreign companies weren't just assisting, they were taking total control. They were managing the exploration, the operations, the sales, everything. It turned the state into little more than a passive landlord, just sitting back and collecting a fee while someone else ran the entire show. And all this criticism, all this tension, it all came to a head after one of the biggest moments in modern Philippine history. After the People Power Revolution swept the country in 1986, it was time for a fresh start. A new constitution was written, and the people drafting it had a clear goal: reclaim national control over the country's resources. And they did it by making what looks like a tiny change to the text, but it had huge consequences. Okay, so let's look at the old text, the 1973 Constitution. It specifically allowed for service contracts and gave foreign companies a really wide lane, letting them provide management or other forms of assistance. That was the phrase that gave them so much power. Now check this out. Look at the new wording from the 1987 Constitution. Foreign companies can still be involved, but only for either technical or financial assistance. The real power move here isn't what they added, it's what they took out. Did you catch it? It's all about what's missing. The framers of the new Constitution deliberately deleted two things. First, the term service contracts is completely gone, and just as critical, they erase the word management. This was absolutely not an accident. And in case there was any doubt about why they did it, we have the receipts straight from the constitutional debates. Commissioner Villegas said it plain as day. Getting rid of service contracts was a specific attempt to stop those old abuses, to stop foreign companies from getting around the 60% Filipino ownership rule. The goal was to slam that loophole shut for good. Okay, so with all that history, with that very deliberate change in the law, how did the Supreme Court rule on the 1995 Mining Act and the big deal with Western mining? Boom. Unconstitutional. The court declared key parts of it were illegal. It was a stunning decision that sent absolute shockwaves through the entire industry. So what was the court's thinking? Well, it was actually pretty straightforward. They said that these financial and technical assistance agreements, or FTAs, that the new mining law created were just the old service contracts dressed up in a new name. They still gave foreign companies the power to manage and operate every aspect of the mining activity, and that, the court said, gave them beneficial ownership. It flew right in the face of the 1987 Constitution, which, as we saw, deliberately removed the word management. So, the law and the contract were declared void. I mean, in a nutshell, the Supreme Court basically ruled that the Mining Act was trying to resurrect a ghost. It was trying to bring back the exact system of foreign control that the 1987 Constitution was specifically written to get rid of. At the end of the day, the court was backing up the original vision. Foreign companies could be hired, sure. They could be paid for their technology or their money, but they could never be the beneficial owner of the nation's resources. The state, acting for the Filipino people, had to stay in the driver's seat. And so this whole story leaves us with a really tough, ongoing question. For any country that's rich in resources but needs cash to develop them, how do you find that perfect balance? How do you protect your national wealth for your own people while still making your country an attractive place for the investors you need to get that wealth out of the ground? There really are no easy answers.